I'm going to kick off now with Paul Bernal, who has been really from when the Right to Be Forgotten started to get hot in Europe around 2010-11, has been an expert throughout. And I think we can now, we've heard how well everything's working, so now we can get into the controversies. And I also want to exercise one chair's prerogative, which is I think it's worth noting that it's never a good thing to have all male panels. So to all of you organising events, there are some excellent people on this subject. Orla Linsky, Lorna Woods, Lillian Edwards, there's many, and we've got many in the audience, so there's going to be all female questions. Sorry, Uta and Sarah and everybody. And everybody else can ask them in the break.
In our defence, we tried all of those women and none of them were good.
Well, I'll cause it more.
Yes, I've got a woman's name.
Everybody else is a woman.
That's quite an interesting point on names. That one of the things that Google does on the Right to Be Forgotten is it tries to recognise whether people's names are names. And at least one of my Dutch friends, Google don't think his name is a name because it looks too peculiar to them because they're coming from a very slanted perspective. And I think what I'm going to talk about more than anything else is that perspective, and that we have to, I want to take a big step back and look at this whole thing from a deeper perspective. What's actually going on, what matters, what controls these things, why do we care about all of this? And I'm going to do this all in 10 minutes. I'm just going to talk about, as I put on my slides, which is not the title originally presented, power and perspective on the so-called right to be forgotten. I mean, back in 2010, I was already complaining about this term, right to be forgotten. My first academic piece is called A Right to Delete, which is my first academic piece on this subject, because I didn't like that, and that's 2011. I still don't like it, but I have to surrender to the overall power. This is what people talk about. And because this is what people talk about, we have to accept that. Why do people talk about it? Because of the power behind the kind of messages that go on. I think the first thing I want to say is, again, to step back and look about why we talk about rights to start with, why we need rights, who needs rights, when do they need rights, and so on. And that, in general, and I'm oversimplifying enormously, a right is needed to protect someone who has less power from something that has more power. Whether that's an individual from the state, or from a huge corporation, or a weaker individual from a stronger individual. In general, the power relationship is key to where the rights apply. And there are many reasons for that. The individual needs more protection, the weaker one, and the stronger person generally has other ways of getting what they want. They don't necessarily need the legal mechanisms, the protections to do so. So when we talk about rights, there's almost an idea that people have, and particularly in this idea, when we'll talk about freedom of expression a little bit, that somehow there should be equal rights for equal people, and that's how it applies. That's not actually in practice what really matters so much. In practice, and I'm trying to think of this from a very pragmatic perspective, it's to protect weaker people, weaker groups from stronger groups, but rights are what really matters. And freedom of speech, this is particularly true. And again, this is something that isn't really talked about. Freedom of speech is treated with such reverence, particularly across the other side of the Atlantic from here, that it's seen as if it's something that we shouldn't actually analyse. But freedom of speech is about speaking truth to power. It's about holding the powerful to account, much more than it is about just kind of letting everybody say what they want to say when they want to say it, which is a kind of very loose way that freedom of speech is often talked about. And in privacy, the general importance of privacy is again to protect the weak from the strong. You need privacy from those who can wield power over you, whether that be the state, corporations, if you're a child, you need privacy from your parents. I have a 9-year-old daughter. She definitely needs privacy from me, and she demands it. An employee needs privacy from their employer, and so on. In all these ways, it's actually the point about the right is to protect the weak from the strong. And, of course, then you have the difficulty of determining who is weak and who is strong, and then we have all kinds of issues surrounding that. And what it's all about, in that perspective, is finding a balance. And again, when we talk about the right to be forgotten, a lot of the debate has not been about a balance, it's actually been about fundamental rights. We've got to protect freedom of speech. This is an infringement of this. You can't tamper with that. Not about actually finding a balance between rights. Now, Julia described me as an academic rabble-rouser at the beginning. I'm not going to do my big rabble-rousing thing, which is that I actually think the right to be forgotten is a tool in favour of freedom of speech and access to information, not against, because I think that would start too many arguments. But it isn't so clearly a weapon against them. And that's what I would really like to say. So, with apologies to the fact that Google has sponsored this, I've been at privacy conferences sponsored by Facebook before, which is another interesting thing. But I think when we look at power, we have to think about the power of Google. I could say the power of Microsoft in relation to Bing, but really, still the emphasis is on Google. Because, in terms of these rights, that's the key here. Google has power in lots of different dimensions. It has power as a search engine, that is, in determining which information we have access to. It has power as what I loosely call an internet giant, in terms of its influence of the whole internet experience we have, all the different arms of Google, whether it's Maps or YouTube and so on, they have a huge amount of influence. It has power as a corporation and as a political influencer. Simply, the scale of money that they have and their ability to lobby is an enormous amount of power. And it has power as an agenda setter. And that's actually one of the interesting things. I was very interested in both the ICO and the CNIL having good relationships with Google. I'm not quite sure you're supposed to have good relationships with Google. You are in one way, and you've got to, but actually, one of the biggest problems we have sometimes is when corporations have too good relationships with governments and regulators that are supposed to be holding them to account kind of on our behalf in some way. I'm not criticising, because it's also true, you've got to have a good relationship in order to get your work done. So it's a complex balance to make. And Google as an agenda setter is particularly clear on the right to be forgotten, because the Google Advisory Council on the right to be forgotten was seen as a hugely kind of neutral thing. And I can see I'm going to run over it enormously, so I'll go faster on the next bit. Because Google sets this agenda by trying to present itself as a neutral thing. And that's why it gets all this kind of protected. It's part of the infrastructure. But is anything actually natural or organic or neutral about Google? There's this idea that crowdsourcing, which is kind of what Google does with its algorithms, is somehow neutral. It's not. Crowds aren't neutral. Crowds are mobs. I've been in them. I'm a football fan. I'm a protester. We're not the neutral thing that we like to be. And what the public is interested in is not the same, necessarily, as what's in the public interest. And mobs, groups, can be steered in different directions, and are steered in different directions. But there's also the idea that Google is part of the infrastructure. And again, one of my contentions is that they try to present this image. They link themselves with Wikipedia, who are also seen as part of the infrastructure. Again, seen as neutral, and the neutral point of view is one of the 5 pillars of Wikipedia. But at the same time, they claim free speech rights. And the contradiction between claiming free speech rights as a search engine and being a neutral part of the infrastructure is one that isn't really addressed sufficiently or acknowledged sufficiently. In a 2012 paper commissioned by Google, a white paper by Volok and Falk, they argued in favour of freedom of speech for a search engine, and they said, I'll get the right quote here, humans are the ones who decide how the algorithm should predict the likely usefulness of a web page. As a consequence, search exercises editorial judgment about what constitutes useful information. Editorial judgment and humans writing the algorithm. Therefore, we have free speech rights. But if we have free speech rights, we're not neutral. Can we be? Is it possible? I don't think so. And then we get to a much more deeper kind of political, philosophical point. Is it actually possible for there to be neutrality? And politically speaking, Ayn Rand versus Karl Marx, extremes, but very, very different. And a lot of people don't realise that Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales, is an advocate of Ayn Rand's objectivism. And that's where the idea of neutrality comes from. Now, some people take the other side, the Marxist view that effectively everything is political, there is no such thing as neutrality under any circumstances. And I'm not saying I would agree with either, but it is a question that we should ask. We should say whether neutrality exists. And Jimmy Wales being on Google's advisory council for the right to be forgotten is yet another example of the tying in between Google and Wikipedia and the attempt to bring in this illusion of neutrality. But Google's a business, and the bottom line is the bottom line. So, I'm going to finish right now. I think all of this should mean that we should take the right to be forgotten from a very different perspective. We should start saying, actually, this is not about bad guys. You call yourself a bad guy, I think? Bad guys with big sticks beating up freedom of expression. It's actually about different powers coming into conflict that need to be seen for what they are. And what I like about the Google Spain ruling is that it does actually potentially allow individuals, weak individuals, to wield some power over what information is found out about them. And it does it in a way when things actually affect them and their lives, which is when they need those rights. And the law should only intervene when it absolutely has to. That's another kind of general principle. But sometimes it really does have to. And why, for example, the Russian idea of having the right to be forgotten that does apply to public figures is fundamentally wrong. Because it's not the weak being protected against the strong, it's the strong adding another layer of protection against the weak. And why we have to be much more careful about how and where we allow these things to come in. Okay?